Section 2 of The Heroines of History. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine H. The Heroines of History by John S. Jenkins. Section 2. Cleopatra, Part 1. Por Cleopatra o Egipto ful vencido. Mascarenas. Whatever might have been the character of the person occupying the throne of the Ptolemies during the time of the Caesars and the Triumvirate, it may well be doubted whether the independence of Egypt, under any other circumstances than those which attended the complete subjection of that kingdom to the Roman sway, could have been longer maintained, in opposition to the colossal power whose victorious standards were planted on the rocky shores of the Atlantic, or fanned by the soft breezes of the Orient. And perhaps it was rather the misfortune than the fault of the fair but frail descendant of a long line of illustrious princes, that she was the last of her dynasty and race who ruled in the home of her ancestors. Nay, is it not certain that the charms which captivated Caesar and enthralled the heart of Antony, though powerless to save her country from the doom that awaited it, put far off the evil day of its undoing? The Egyptian kings had long been the mere allies of Rome, and such vassalage was almost sure to be the precursor of entire subjugation. Yet it is for the very reason offered by the Portuguese poet in her condemnation, that for, or on account of her, Egypt was vanquished, that the name of Cleopatra is so famous in history. The poet who has dwelt with delight on her charms and her follies, and the historian whose periods have grown eloquent as he depicted her graces and lamented the weakness with which they were allied, have referred to them more as the causes which produced the downfall of the Egyptian monarchy, than as the effects of that national degeneracy which preceded it. As the beauty and the shame of Helen are first in the thought of the traveler who pauses beside the yellow waters of the Scamander and looks around him but in vain for the memorials of ancient Ilium, so he who gazes on the humble promontory that breaks the waters of the Ionian Sea forgets that the crescent of the Moslem is reflected in the blue waters that sparkle beneath it. Time rolls back the events which she has numbered. The proud galleys of Egypt's queen and her doting lover pass in review before him, and he remembers only that here was lost a world for woman, lovely, harmless thing. But the story of the false bride of Menelaus is all a fable, and thus too may it be said that historic truth does not warrant the conclusion that Egypt was overthrown for the sake of Cleopatra. It is enough that she presided, as it were, over the catastrophe which she could not avert, to invest it with the attractions of romance. The seeds of disillusion were not, in fact, planted by her hand. She but neglected to check their growth. Under her auspices, the last days of the monarchy were spent in the soft dalliance of love, in excess and voluptuousness, instead of the misery and confusion of a hopeless and protracted warfare. One after another of the Roman generals who designed to wrest from her the kingdom she had inherited was made captive by her beauty, and in her embraces forgot the high ambition which had before been his mistress. And it was only when that beauty had faded and could no longer ensnare, that the Egypt whose glory and splendor had once been unrivaled was humbled in the dust. The beauty and the love of Cleopatra had preserved for a season, but they did not secure the independence of her country, and the same hour that witnessed the overthrow of the one beheld the failure of the other. Cleopatra was born about the year 68 B.C. Her father, Ptolemy Auletes, had ascended the throne of Egypt under the patronage of the Roman Senate. His predecessor, Alexander Ptolemy III, having bequeathed his kingdom to the Romans, although, as he had been banished by his subjects, It was a matter of some doubt whether he was capable of making such a disposition of his crown. Auletes was a shrewd and politic prince. With the sum of 6,000 talents, he purchased the favor and friendship of Julius Caesar and Pompey, and through their influence secured the alliance of Rome. His people, indignant at his conduct, revolted from his authority and drove him into exile. But they were compelled again to receive and recognize him as their king by the presence of a Roman army. Subsequent to this reestablishment of his power, the peace of the realm was not disturbed, and until his death he continued in the uninterrupted possession of his kingdom. Auletes had 2 sons and 3 daughters, but 2 of his daughters survived him. The eldest, whose name was Berenice, was put to death by her father because she had worn the crown and assumed the royal authority during his exile. By his will, therefore, he left the government of Egypt to his eldest son and his second daughter, the latter being the renowned Cleopatra. He also directed, in accordance with the usage of the Alexandrian court, that they should marry together and reign jointly. As both were minors, they were placed under the guardianship of the Roman Senate, by whom Pompey was selected to fulfill the duties of the office. At the time of her father's death, Cleopatra had nearly reached her 17th year, that season of poetry and love. She stood just upon the threshold of womanhood, the faultless outlines of the girl wanting but the filling up to perfect a form unmatched among Egyptian maidens for symmetry and grace. She was tall of stature and queenly in gait and appearance. Her features were regular, and every limb finely molded, though yet lacking the round and voluptuous fullness of her ripened beauty. The warm sun of that southern clime had tinged her cheek with a hue of brown, but her complexion was clear and pure as the serene sky that smiled above her head, and distinctly traced beneath it were the delicate veins, filled with the rich blood that danced so wildly when inflamed with hate or heated with desire. Her eyes and hair were like jet, and glossy as the raven's plume. The former were large, and, as was characteristic of her race, apparently half shut and slightly turned up at the outer angles, thus adding a great deal to the naturally arch expression of her countenance. But they were full, too, of brilliancy and fire. Her silken ringlets fell in long flowing masses down the stately neck, and over the snowy throat, and the polished shoulders, and the wavy bosom where love delighted to make his pillow. Both nose and chin were small, but fashioned as with all the nicety of the sculptor's art, and her pearly teeth nestled lovingly between the coral lips whose kisses were sweet as honey from the hives of Hybla. But her beauty was not all mere comeliness of form and feature. To the witchery of Venus she added something of the dignity of Juno. Beside the personal charms that might arouse the slumbering passions of an anchorite, she possessed the most exquisite mental gifts. Her countenance was expressive, and her dark sparkling eyes beamed with intelligence. With a fondness for philosophy, she united a love of letters as rare as it was attractive, and in the companionship of scholars and poets her mind expanded as she added to its priceless store of wealth. She was not only familiar with the heroic tales and traditions, with the poetic myths and chronicles, and the religious legends of ancient Chemia, but she was well versed, too, in the literature and science of Phoenicia and Chaldea, of Greece and Rome. Of both the Greek and the Latin tongue she was a complete mistress, and with the swarthy Ethiop and the fierce Bedouin of the desert, with the Jew and the Syrian, the Mede and the Persian, she could converse without an interpreter. Delighting, as she indeed did, in the love songs of Anacreon, she often turned with interest to the dark volumes of papyrus containing the historic fragments of Manetho and Eratosthenes. Much as she admired Homer and Pindar, they were not more her favorites than Euclid or Archimedes, than Anaxagoras or Aristotle, and Apollonius of Perga occupied as high a place in her regard as his namesake the Rhodian. She was skilled also in metallurgy and chemistry, and a proficient in astronomy, and the other sciences cultivated in the age in which she lived. In the lighter accomplishments she was not deficient. She possessed a fine taste, which had been highly cultivated. The female graces for which Miletus was so widely famed, beautified and adorned her character. Her skill in music found none to equal it. Her voice itself was perfect melody, and when breathed through the soft tibia, fell upon the listening ear with a magic power, and bathed the drooping spirits in delight beyond the bliss of dreams. Touched by her fingers, the cithern seemed instinct with life, and from its strings there rolled a gushing flood of glorious symphonies. She was eloquent and imaginative, witty and animated. Her conversation, therefore, was charming, and if she exhibited caprice, which she sometimes did, it was forgotten in the inimitable grace of her manner. Had she not been fond of pleasure, she would have constituted an exception to the times. Yet she was no Sybarite, but like Aspasia, or to find her parallel in a later age, like Margaret of Valois, she loved to mingle the intellectual with the sensual. There had been a reaction in the social condition of the Egyptian people. The sacerdotal power was diminished. The influence of their strange religion was weakened. The prejudice of caste was not felt to the same extent as formerly. Refinement had taken the place of austerity, and licentiousness that of gloomy formalism. This change commenced with her father's reign, and her character was formed by the circumstances that surrounded her. Her vices were those of the age. Her virtues, few though they may have been, were cherished in spite of it. She was superstitious, but superstition was then religion. She was cruel, but cruelty was the besetting sin of nations and individuals. She was selfish. Why should she not have been selfish, with enemies plotting and conspiring against her at her father's court, and seeking in every way to compass her destruction? She was ambitious, but when were the sons or daughters of kings and princes without ambition? She possessed strong and ardent passions, which she rarely attempted to control, but they were the only feelings she was at liberty to gratify. She was formed to love and be loved in return, but both the law and her religion forbade the indulgence of an honest affection. Such was the youthful queen of Egypt when she ascended the throne of her father, not as sole mistress, but enjoying a divided empire, and coupled too with a condition, that of her marriage with her brother, who was still younger than herself, from which she revolted, not from principle indeed, than for the reason that its fulfillment was abhorrent to her inclinations. A mutual dislike seems to have been early formed between them, and the flame was industriously fanned by the designing counselors and favorites of young Ptolemy. Not less ambitious than his sister and wife, but her inferior in talents, in accomplishments, and in every attribute necessary to maintain the dignity appropriate to his position, he was but the tool and creature of abler and more designing men. The strong aversion conceived for each other by the royal pair was soon changed to the most rancorous hate. The Egyptian people were by no means favorable to the rule of a female sovereign, and this national prejudice contributed a great deal to strengthen the influence of the king's advisers. While the joint power remained in the hands of Cleopatra, they could do nothing. She was too intelligent to be a dupe, too ambitious to acknowledge a superior, and therefore it became their aim and object to deprive her of her share in the sovereignty. Their plans for the time were successful. Acting under the influence of Vatinus, his tutor, of Achillas, the general of his army, and Theodotus, the rhetorician, Ptolemy refused to allow her to participate in the administration of his government. It was not in the nature of Cleopatra to submit to so great an indignity. She claimed her rights with a boldness and spirit which, among any other people, would have aroused a general and irrepressible feeling of enthusiasm in her favor. But the prejudices of the populace were stimulated and aroused by the artful ministers, and they too joined in the cry against her. too proud to compromise her dignity by a surrender of her authority, she was nevertheless forced to yield to the tide of popular fury. But the heroic heart that beat in her bosom was unsubdued. Obliged to fly from Egypt, she hastened to Palestine and Syria, to collect an army that might enable her to recover the heritage of which she had been deprived. Just at this juncture, the fate of Rome and the world was decided on the plains of Pharsalia. Pompey fled to Egypt, but was treacherously murdered by the cruel Ptolemy and his ministers. The victorious Caesar followed close upon his track, with an army too small for conquest, but having in its leader a host. He was then at the zenith of his power, and brave men trembled when his name was uttered. The murder of his great enemy did not secure his friendship, as the counselors of Ptolemy had anticipated. He treated them with coldness, and demanded the prompt payment of a sum of money due to him from Auletes. Anarchy now reigned in Egypt. Altercations and disputes between the respective adherents of Cleopatra and her brother were of daily occurrence. Assassinations were frequent, violence usurped the place of justice, and crime went unpunished. While this state of things existed, Caesar could not expect that his claim would be satisfied, for the turbulent state of the country afforded abundant excuses or pretenses for postponing its consideration, or evading it altogether. Accordingly, it was his policy to promote the early restoration of order and quiet, and to that end he proposed, as the representative of the Roman Senate and nation, to hear and determine the dispute between Cleopatra and her brother. In the meantime, the fair refugee had nearly completed her preparations, and was about to return to Egypt to maintain her right to the throne by force of arms. Having received the summons of Caesar to appoint some person to plead her cause before him, she determined to obey it, but to be her own advocate. And fearing that the arbiter might be prejudiced against her by Ptolemy and his ministers, she resolved to seek a private interview with him without delay. Lest her approach should be suspected, and means be taken to prevent any communication with the Roman general, she sailed from Syria in a frail skiff, attended but by a single friend, Apollodorus, a Sicilian Greek. Caesar himself had not dared to venture out to sea, on account of the prevalence of the fierce Etesian winds. But nothing daunted her buoyant soul. It was a high stake in peril, her crown and kingdom, everything to her. Each moment was pregnant with danger, and the dark waters of the Mediterranean frowned gloomily upon her. Yet she knew not what it was to fear, for wind and wave seemed but to throb in unison with the wild, fierce passions that sustained her. Arrived off the harbor of Alexandria, she found that it would be impossible to effect a landing in safety, and to avoid the spies and elude the vigilance of Photinus and Achillas, except by stratagem. Her woman's wit and cunning now served her well. Having procured some cloths and other fabrics, such as were brought for sale by foreign merchants, she spread them out, and laid herself at full length upon them. Following her directions, her faithful attendant Apollodorus wound them about her person, and then tied the bundle with a thong, in the same manner as packages of goods were secured. Thus hidden from all stranger eyes, she was conveyed in the dusk of evening to the quarters of the Roman commander, her companion sustaining for the nonce the character of a merchant, and bearing the load of beauty on his shoulders as if it were but common merchandise. In answer to all inquiries, he said he bore a present for Caesar. That was true, though not in the sense in which he was understood, but the reply was sufficient, and he pursued his way unmolested through crowds of citizens and soldiers, and past all the lines of guards, till he reached the presence of the illustrious Roman, and deposited the fair burden at his feet. Then he unloosed the package, and instead of Tyrian purples, of scarfs from Sidon glistening with their splendid saffron dyes, or shawls of Babylon enriched with stripes of gold, or sprinkled with woven flowers, there sprang forth, like Venus from the waves of ocean, a woman robed in beauty such as poet never dreamed, nor sculptor's art could fashion. The matchless Queen of Egypt stood before him, her disordered apparel but half concealing the matured charms of 20 summers, her unbound tresses floating to her feet, her short-sleeved tunic leaving the white arms uncovered which outshone the armillae of pearls that clasped them, her olive-brown cheek tinged with blushes, and her dark eyes beaming with anxiety and hope. She came, she saw and conquered. Though always addicted to sensual indulgences, Caesar had now passed his 50th year, and the hot blood of youth no longer warmed his veins. Yet passion was not wholly dead within him. He was unprepared for so much loveliness, and it filled him with surprise. Her charming conversation, her sparkling vivacity and wit increased the fascinating influence whose spell was on him, and he yielded, without an effort of resistance, to its power. His Roman wife was forgotten, and in the arms of Cleopatra he promised that her will, in Egypt, should be second to his own. It was nothing strange that the attachment should be reciprocated by the Egyptian queen; not strange that, escaping from an incestuous connection, she should indulge an unlawful passion; not strange that, flying from the imbecile husband provided for her, she should find a refuge in a hero's love. There was much in the character of the Roman statesman and warrior that was calculated to inspire her regard. His person was not displeasing to her, and his renown, his soldierly skill and daring, his intelligence and his manly independence, all combined to attract her to him. She loved him, no doubt, sincerely, and manifested her affection by an intimacy which, though outraging decency and virtue, was but in keeping with the customs and manners of the time. She could not be his wife, and therefore became his mistress. On the day following this strange interview, Caesar sent for young Ptolemy, and advised him to become reconciled with Cleopatra, to take her as his wife, and share with her the regal power. The suspicions of the young monarch were at once aroused, and when he learned, as he soon did, that his sister was at that moment in the apartments of Caesar, his anger rose beyond control. Rushing from the palace into the open street, he tore the kingly diadem from off his head and trampled it beneath his feet. To the people who crowded around him, he said that he had been betrayed, and called upon them to avenge him. For his dishonor, if he knew it then, he cared but little, as he had before sought to compass the death of Cleopatra. But that she was under the protection and enjoyed the confidence of Caesar seemed ominous of ill. His story excited the sympathy of the populace, and placing himself at their head, he returned to the palace for the purpose of attacking Caesar. But his ungovernable rage only led him into further difficulty. He was seized by the Roman soldiers, and forced to acquiesce in the arrangement which Caesar had indicated. An assembly of the Egyptian people was held, by order of the Roman commander, at which he announced his decision, as guardian and arbiter, that Ptolemy and Cleopatra should reign together jointly in Egypt, according to the will of their father, and that Ptolemy their younger brother, and Arsinoe the younger sister, should exercise joint rule in Cyprus, then a Roman possession, but formerly one of the dependencies of Egypt, and now restored by Caesar. In this decree, both Ptolemy and Cleopatra, who were present when it was pronounced, concurred without hesitation, and their example was followed by all the principal dignitaries in the kingdom. But the peace thus concluded was a hollow one. The decision of Caesar was fatal to the ambitious design of Pothinus, and at his instigation Achillas refused to give his assent, and marched with the Egyptian army upon Alexandria. Ptolemy, too, only waited for an opportunity to manifest his disinclination to abide by an arrangement which had been forced upon him. While in the capital he was but the mere prisoner of Caesar, and he desired to be released from the unwelcome surveillance. Professing the sincerest attachment to the Roman general, he deceived him so far that he was permitted to go to the Egyptian camp, in order, as he said, to prevail upon his friends to submit to the decree. Once there, he threw off all disguise and prepared for hostilities. End of Section 2. Section 3 of The Heroines of History. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine H. The Heroines of History by John S. Jenkins, Section 3. Cleopatra, Part 2. The Alexandrian War now succeeded. Various fortune attended the movements and operations of the rival parties. At one time, the little Roman army seemed doomed to be overwhelmed by the superior force of the Egyptians, but the good genius of Caesar did not desert him. He manfully supported the cause of Cleopatra, which he had espoused, and by repeated exposures of his own person to danger and peril for her sake, awakened in her bosom still more powerful feelings of affection and regard. At length, being seconded by the Roman troops from Syria and Cilicia, Caesar prosecuted the war with his accustomed vigor, and it finally ended in the complete overthrow and death of Ptolemy and the general recognition of the authority of Cleopatra. During the series of contests that took place in the vicinity of Alexandria, a large portion of the city was destroyed by fire, including its chiefest ornament, the noble library founded by the Ptolemies. At one time all seemed lost, but through the gathering gloom, the star of Caesar shone with a luster as of old. Midst the ashes and ruins of the Capitol, his banners floated proudly in triumph or in defiance. From street to street, the enemy were driven by his victorious arms until the beleaguered city was relieved. Indifferent to peril, he shared every risk, and each day the heart of Cleopatra warmed toward him as she beheld him fearlessly encountering danger for her sake. Before, she had but loved him. Now, gratitude turned her love into devotion. The war being ended, Cleopatra was proclaimed anew the Queen of Egypt, and in order to gratify the disaffected partisans of Ptolemy, and to allay the prejudices of the people, Caesar decreed that she should marry her younger brother, and that he should be associated with her in the government. This marriage, however, was one of mere form, as the younger Ptolemy was then but 11 years of age, and Cleopatra continued to share the counsels and the bed of Caesar. Having thus put down all opposition and restored peace and tranquillity to the kingdom, Caesar and Cleopatra made a royal progress through the valley of the Nile, accompanied by his Roman guards, by a large retinue of friends, and by troops of servants and attendants. Slowly and leisurely they ascended the great river, whose banks were yellow with the ripening harvest, in barges with poops of burnished gold, the oars inlaid with silver, keeping time with the measured tones of sweetest music, and the carved prows cleaving the waters softly, like mermaids in their merry sports. Reclining beneath silken awnings spangled with stars and flowers, upon carpets that yielded to the slightest pressure, and in whose woof the velvet foliage of the amaranth was blended with eastern roses and the azure flowers of the sacred lotus, the Egyptian queen and her noble lover passed the day in slumber, lulled by the mellow strains of barbiton and pipe, and fanned by the scented gales of Araby the Blessed. At the fall of even, the tents were pitched upon the shore, and summoned, as it were, by magic, long files of slaves came forth, bearing the vessels of gold and silver for the feast. The board was spread with fish and sesamum, with soup of alica, with olives, cakes, and sweetmeats, and the luscious fruits of Yemen. Wines made from the palm and grape, cooled in the vases of Coptos, or sparkled in the golden craters wrought by Argive artists with exquisite skill, and lamps of perfumed oil and censers filled with burning incense, scattered their rich odors through the groves of date palms and acacias. The night was spent in merriment and feasting, and when the morrow came, it but renewed the scenes of yesterday. In revelry like this, in love's soft dalliance, the winged hours flew swiftly by. Though his presence was no longer needed, Caesar still lingered at the Alexandrian court. Cleopatra became the mother of a son, named after his father Caesarion. Thus there was another tie between them, and it was difficult to separate. At last the revolt of Pharnaces obliged him to break loose from the sweet thraldom which had detained him, and hastening forthwith to Syria, he defeated the rebel prince and drove him out of the kingdom of Pontus. Meanwhile, his enemies at home, not without cause, had brought discredit on his name, and even his warmest and most faithful friends did not withhold their censures, for that he had not resisted the blandishments of the Egyptian Circe. Leaving a sufficient number of his troops with Cleopatra to enable her to suppress any outbreak that might occur, he now returned to Rome, taking with him her sister, the young Arsinoe, who had fallen into his hands as a prisoner on the defeat of Ptolemy, to grace the triumph decreed him by the Roman Senate. From this time, and until the death of Caesar, the reign of Cleopatra was not disturbed by foreign war or internal commotions. Her power was firmly established, and no one disputed her authority. During the minority of her brother, she administered the government alone, with a skill and ability not unworthy of the race from which she sprung. Though too much devoted to pleasure and gaiety, she was not without ambition. She conciliated the favor of her subjects by her attention to their interests, by the encouragement of commerce and the arts, and by the restoration of the capital to its former splendor. Under the powerful protection of the first man in Rome, none dared to molest her. Kings and princes courted her alliance, and stood in awe of her name. It was, perhaps, a frail tenure, the will of Caesar, by which she held the scepter, but it was also the sole alternative of absolute submission to the Roman rule. Egypt was already doomed. Nature had made her the granary of the world, and she was far too valuable a prize to be either overlooked or forgotten. It had been the original intention of Caesar to bring Cleopatra to Rome, and there to marry her. For that purpose, he had solicited a friend to propose a law to the people, allowing a Roman citizen to marry as many wives as he thought fit. His friend acceded to the request, but nothing had been done when he returned to Rome. Opposition to his project being anticipated, no further steps were taken, though he continued as deeply enamored with her as ever, and many tender messages were wont to pass between them. Had he lived and attained the imperial power, it is not improbable that she would have become his wife, and certainly in one respect, as the two most conspicuous personages in the world, they would have been fitly mated. She the bride of Caesar, Caesar Emperor of Rome. What might have been the fate of both? What the destiny of the Niobe of nations? Events now followed each other in rapid succession. Cleopatra did not soon forget her love for Caesar. She visited him at Rome, became an inmate of his palace, and usurped the place which his wife should have occupied. But her hopes of an alliance with him, in which he probably shared, were suddenly frustrated by his assassination. The Roman people did not regard her with favor, and she returned forthwith to Egypt. Disappointed in the darling object of her heart, she resolved to reign alone, and was not disposed to share her throne with a husband forced upon her acceptance. When her younger brother, therefore, having reached the age of 14 years, claimed his share of the regal power, she removed him by poison, and was thenceforth sole mistress of the realm. Her court, like that of her father, was distinguished alike for its refinement and its voluptuousness. She was the patron both of learning and of love. The fame of her wit and beauty were noised abroad, and Alexandria became a favorite resort of travelers. To all she gave a cordial welcome, whether philosophers and men of letters, or gay gallants in quest of pleasure. It would seem that Cleopatra hesitated at first whether to ally herself with the triumvirate or with the party of Brutus and Cassius. Her sympathies were unquestionably with the friends of Caesar, but while it remained in doubt which was the stronger faction, the safety of her kingdom and herself appeared to require that she should not give offence to either. Her hesitation, however, was not of long continuance. Foreseeing the ultimate triumph of the powerful party headed by Antony, Lepidus, and Octavius Caesar, she refused her aid to Cassius, which he had earnestly solicited, and shortly after sailed with a numerous fleet to join the forces of the triumvirate. In consequence of a violent storm, in which many of her ships were destroyed or disabled, she was obliged to return to Egypt, where she remained till the question was decided by the utter discomfiture and overthrow of the republican faction in the battle of Philippi. After the defeat of Brutus and Cassius, and the firm establishment in Greece of the authority of his colleagues and himself, Mark Antony crossed over into Asia to secure and strengthen their interests in that quarter of the world. The prestige of his name was all-powerful. His progress was one continued triumph, not such as best became a conqueror, but dishonored by the most shameful debauchery and excess. Kings bent before him in humble obeisance and laid their hoarded treasures at his feet. Queens, rejoicing in youth and beauty, sought his presence eagerly, and yielded every favor that he asked. Never was the gross sensualism of his character more glaringly exhibited. The wealth of Croesus filled his coffers, but it was needed to furnish new pleasures for his jaded appetite. Sycophants and flatterers shared his gold, and partook with him in every vice and folly. Dancers and buffoons were his companions and attendants, the creatures of his bounty, and the ministers to his passions. Rumors of the sports and revelry, the rioting and feasting in which he delighted, went before him. Cities sent forth their entire population to greet his coming. His followers called him Bacchus, a name that pleased him, and men and boys disguised as Pans and Satyrs, and women dressed as Bacchanals in loose Asiatic robes, with vine wreaths about their heads and fawn skins on their shoulders, ran before him, swinging their thyrsi crowned with acanthus leaves and the foliage and berries of the ivy, beating their drums and cymbals and shouting, "Io Bacche! Io Bacche!" This was Antony, brave but effeminate, talented and eloquent but coarse by nature, generous in disposition but often cruel and unforgiving, sometimes abandoned, as it seemed, to the very lowest vices, and then, breaking loose from his degradation, exhibiting his character radiant with its old light. This was the Antony who, history tells us, was ruined by the arts of Cleopatra, as if he were an unwilling victim, and she were wrong, judged by the standard of her time, in adopting the only means that could save her country from impending ruin. Antony had cast a longing eye on Egypt, and he wanted but a pretext, whether reasonable or unreasonable, to occupy it with his troops, abolish its government and laws, and seat a Roman governor on the throne of Cleopatra. He had been informed that the governor of Phoenicia, then an Egyptian province, had aided Cassius, and he now summoned her before him to answer for the conduct of her subordinate. His lieutenant, Dellius, was charged with his commands to her to meet him at Tarsus, the capital of Cilicia. To disobey this summons was to incur the displeasure of Antony, with Lepidus and Octavius, joint ruler of the world, and to arm the whole power of Rome against her feeble kingdom. She determined, therefore, to comply, but that it might seem like condescension, rather than enforced submission, she did not hasten the preparations for her journey. From Dellius she learned the weak points of Antony. She knew his character and felt assured that he would prove an easy conquest. He was fond of money, not so much for its own sake as for the pleasures and amusements it could purchase. So, from her affluence, she provided herself with the richest presents and an ample store of gold and silver. He was vain, and relished display and pomp. So she caused a barge to be built, whose magnificence had never yet been equalled, and its accompaniments and her own habits and ornaments were suited to her dignity and wealth, and in keeping with the show and splendor with which she intended to dazzle the eyes of all beholders, and to charm and captivate the Roman general. But more than all, he was the courteous Antony, whom ne'er the word of no woman heard speak. And so she brought herself. And Cleopatra was not now the young and inexperienced girl who gave her love to Caesar. She was in her 26th year, and every charm was perfected, every grace was finished. With both mind and person fully developed, winning in her address, fascinating in conversation, possessing a vivacity in whose presence melancholy was changed to mirthfulness, and skilled in every art of wantonness and coquetry, she was peerless and irresistible. None knew it better than herself, none felt it more than Antony. Though she received many pressing letters from Antony and his friends, urging her to expedite her movements, she affected to treat them with disdain, and lingered long at every place she visited upon the way. No thought of haste appeared to animate her, but she traveled slowly, as if intent on pleasure, or delighting to provoke the impatience of those who waited for her arrival. At last her fleet was moored within the entrance of the Silver Cydnus, and then, in the splendid galley brought across the sea, followed by a long line of smaller barges, she ascended the river to Tarsus. It was a glorious pageant. The richest carvings adorned her barge, which fairly blazed with gold and splendor. Its sails of brightest purple swelled gracefully with the soft south wind that strained its silken cordage. Its oars, both blade and handle tipped and bound with silver, moved in harmony with the voluptuous music of the flute, the pipe, and cithern. Above it floated the mystic ensign of the Egyptian monarchs, and from the burning censers on its prow, clouds of odorous perfume were wafted to the shore. Upon its deck was raised a lofty canopy of cloth of gold, beneath which, on a cushioned couch, with ivory and tortoise-shell inlaid, reclined the dark-eyed Queen of Egypt. She was robed like Venus, in a purple mantle, glittering with diamonds, and its border ornamented with threads of gold and silver intertwined. Roses and myrtles were wreathed about her brows. Her ears were pierced with rings of orichalcum, a necklace of precious stones encircled her swan-like throat, the golden cestus clasped her waist, and golden sandals encased her tiny feet. Beautiful boys, disguised as Cupids, stood beside her and fanned her with their wings. Damsels, among the fairest at her court, whose hour'd beauty could not be surpassed, were habited as Nereids and Graces, in loose transparent robes, and waited to do her bidding, or managed the helm and sails with great dexterity and skill. The tackling silk, the streamers waved with gold, the gentle winds were lodged in purple sails. Her nymphs, like Nereids, round her couch were placed, where she, another sea-born Venus, lay. She lay and leaned her cheek upon her hand, and cast a look so languishingly sweet, as if, secure of all beholders' hearts, neglecting she could take them. Boys like Cupids stood fanning with their painted wings the winds that played about her face. But if she smiled, a darting glory seemed to blaze abroad that man's desiring eyes were never wearied, but hung upon the object. To soft flutes the silver oars kept time, and while they played, the hearing gave new pleasures to the sight, and both to thought. 'Twas heaven, or somewhat more, for she so charmed all hearts that gazing crowds stood panting on the shore, and wanted breath to give their welcome voice. Dryden's All for Love, Act 3. The shore was lined with people who watched the barge laden with so much beauty, with straining eyes. As it moved along, the cry was raised that Venus had come to feast with Bacchus. From mouth to mouth it passed until it reached the marketplace in Tarsus. All hastened forth to witness her approach, all save Antony, who, deserted by suitors and attendants, remained alone on the tribunal where he was seated. Immediately upon her landing, he sent an officer to her with his greeting, coupled with the request that she should come and sup with him. "Go, tell your master," was her reply, "that it is more fitting that he should come and sup with me." This assumption of social superiority put an end at once to all the dignity which Antony proposed to assume. He accepted the invitation of Cleopatra, and thus, at the very outset, exhibited a deference toward her by which she did not fail to profit. For luxurious magnificence and costly and profuse extravagance, the entertainment provided by Cleopatra had never yet been equaled. Her tents and pavilions, hung with cloth of gold or silken tapestry from the looms of Tyre and Sidon, were pitched beside the sparkling water of the Cydnus, in a noble grove of spreading plane trees and stately laurels. Lamps of bronze and gold, suspended by gilt chains or supported by lofty candelabra, arranged in squares and circles, and raised or depressed at pleasure, shed their perfumed light around. Blazing censers filled with choicest spices loaded the air with fragrance. There were long rows of marble tables and silver tripods, covered with tureens and urns and vases of gold and silver, fashioned with elegance and taste. Large silver lances or chargers, splendidly embossed, contained the juicy meats, the fish, the hares, the pheasants. The bread and fruited cake were brought in silver baskets. Bronze dishes, with ornaments inlaid, were filled with eggs and rows of fishes, with oysters from the Hellespont, with fresh and pickled olives, with frumenty and radishes, with dried dates and raisins, mulberries newly gathered, and almonds and confections. Banqueting cups of most exquisite workmanship were wreathed with garlands and poured brimming full with the rich juice of Chios or the produce of the Egyptian soil, not the mild wines of Thebes and Coptos, but the light, fragrant Marioticum and the oily and aromatic Tenioticum. Upon the ornamented seats and couches reclined the guests, with chaplets of violets and roses, myrtle, ivy, and philyra bound about their temples. Their ears were charmed with the soft strains of music, and buffoons amused them with their droll tricks and pleasantries. Attending servants cooled them with fans of peacock feathers, while they listened to the mythological love stories which the pantomimes related, or watched the dancing girls, who, clad in the gossamer robes of Koa, with golden bangles upon their feet and emerald brooches upon their arms and shoulders, moved with airy steps before them. The sparkling eyes and flashing ornaments, the white arms and the raven hair, the braids and bracelets, swan-like bosoms, the thin robes floating like light. High above them all was Cleopatra, and Antony reclining near her. Upon her head the diadem of Egypt, with the asp, the symbol of divinity, upon it, flashed with rarest gems. Her tunic glittered with all the colors of the East, and was overspread with rich embroidery. A Babylonian shawl of finest tissue was thrown around her shoulders, and at her side there gleamed a Persian dagger, whose hilt was pearls and diamonds. Cushions of crimson damask rose invitingly about her swelling limbs. Her full lips parted but to utter honeyed words. The glow of satisfaction was on her cheek, and in her eye the light of triumph. Joy and merriment everywhere prevailed. The guests pledged each other in wine cups brimming full. Honey and spices were brought and mingled in the wine, and with the fragrant compound they drank the health of Cleopatra. The Roman guards without the tent were also served with sumptuous fare, and instead of Pascha, filled their rhytons with the barley wine of Egypt. End of Section 3. Section 4 of The Heroines of History. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine H. The Heroines of History by John S. Jenkins. Section 4. Cleopatra, Part 3. Antony was in raptures with everything he saw and heard. His expectations were far exceeded. His wildest imaginings had not dwelt upon such splendor and magnificence. The following day he returned the compliment, but his entertainment was so mean compared with hers, that he was obliged to acknowledge himself outdone. He had boasted that Cleopatra should pay him tribute or resign her kingdom, but now he yielded all to her, and even caused her sister, Arsinoe, who had taken refuge in Diana's temple at Miletus, to be put to death, at her request that there should be no rival to contest her throne. She encouraged all his follies, humored every caprice, and laughed at every whim. His coarseness she returned with interest and with infinite wit and grace. He sought her love with warmest protestations, but she yielded with coy submission. "Nay, swear that you love me," she said. "Swear by the holy Osiris." "I swear," he said. Thenceforth she called herself the wife of Antony, though no rite nor ceremony had sanctioned their illicit love. Day after day was given to feasting, each entertainment surpassing in elegance that which preceded it. Antony was astonished at the wealth so lavishly displayed by Cleopatra. She only sneered at what she called his parsimony. At a banquet given by her, he expressed his wonder at the great number of golden cups, enriched with jewels and beautifully wrought, that adorned the tables. She said they were but trifles, and gave them to him. The next day she provided a still more costly entertainment. Antony, as was his custom, brought with him all his officers of rank, and when the feast was ended, she bestowed on each guest the vessels of gold and silver he had used. At another of her banquets she wore in her earrings 2 pearls of immense value, and having made a wager with Antony that she could spend more than 10,000 sestertia upon a single entertainment, the value of the different dishes was estimated, but falling short of that sum, she declared that she could lay out so much upon herself, and calling for a cup of vinegar, dissolved in it one of the pearls, and then drank off the costly draught. She was about to do the same with the other pearl, but the umpire stopped her, and decided the wager in her favor. Forgetful alike of public duties and private ties and obligations, Antony lingered away the time at Tarsus in revelry and dalliance. Affairs in Syria demanded his attention, in consequence of the warlike demonstrations of Parthia, yet they were neglected. At Rome, his individual interests were suffering by reason of his continued absence, but his spirited and ambitious wife, Fulvia, in vain besought him to hasten his return. A spell was thrown around him which he had not the desire, if he possessed the power, to break. The tighter his chains were drawn, the closer he hugged them, the more he loved the beautiful tyrant whose willing slave he was. From Tarsus, Antony and Cleopatra proceeded to Tyre, at which place she was to embark for Alexandria. Here he designed to separate from her, in order to lead the Roman army against the Parthian forces then preparing to enter Syria. But this was not her intention. She had lost Caesar, as she thought, mainly through her own neglect to render her influence over him secure. It was her ambition now to become the acknowledged wife of Antony. His prospects were as fair, if not prematurely blighted, as those of the younger Caesar, whose superior he was in age, in experience, and perhaps in popularity. As his wife, then, she would not only remain the queen of Egypt, but she might be empress of Rome and of the world. To suffer him to leave her, therefore, till the fulfillment of these hopes, which, once buried in the grave of Caesar, had now revived again, would be to ruin them forever. Her arts and blandishments proved irresistible. Home, country, duty, and ambition, all were forgotten by Antony. Instead of leading his soldiers to new victories and planting the Roman eagles in triumph on the banks of the Euphrates, he accompanied Cleopatra to Alexandria. In the Egyptian capital, the scenes at Tarsus were renewed. He gave himself up to all the wild, fierce passions of his nature, and revelled in debauchery and excess. She did not once make the attempt to restrain him, but gave encouragement to every folly, and rejoiced whenever she was able to provide some new pleasure for his entertainment. This was the secret of her power, and she did not hesitate to use it. She was with him day and night. They gamed and feasted and drank together. They fished and hunted in each other's company, and she attended him when he reviewed his troops. Disguised as slaves, they rambled through the city in the dusk of evening, making themselves merry with the faults and frailties of the inhabitants, jesting rudely with those they met, and playing tricks upon them, and often becoming involved in serious brawls and difficulties. They called their mode of life inimitable, and it was so, for it was characterized by unrestrained indulgence and extravagance unbounded. But, while she thus encouraged and ministered to his vices, she neglected no opportunity to impress him and those who were about them with the notion that she possessed superior tact and sagacity. She treated his opinions with levity, and exacted a large share of deference for her own. Even their amusements furnished occasions for triumph over him, which she failed not to improve. One day, when they were fishing, he was deeply chagrined at his ill success, and ordered one of the fishermen to dive under the water secretly and fasten some of the larger fishes that had been taken upon his hook, so that the raillery of the queen might not be provoked. She discovered the trick at once, but affected not to perceive it, and on the following day invited a still more numerous company to witness similar sport. But she privately instructed an experienced diver in her service to procure a salted fish from the market, and when a favorable opportunity offered, to attach it to Antony's hook. This was done, and he drew up the fish amid the laughter and merriment of the whole party. "Go, general," she exclaimed, "leave fishing to us, petty princes of Pharos and Canopus. Your game is cities, kingdoms, and provinces." At length Antony was aroused from his folly and inaction by the intelligence that the Parthian army had been repeatedly victorious in Syria, and that his presence was absolutely necessary to prevent fresh disasters. The news from Rome, too, was far from pleasing to him. His wife and brother, more watchful of his interests than himself, had raised an army to check the ambitious designs of Octavius, but they had been overpowered and were forced to flee from Italy. He proceeded to Phoenicia, however, but the letters of Fulvia finally induced him to turn his course toward Rome. She died at Sicyon, on her way to meet him, and he was afterward reconciled to young Caesar and married his sister Octavia. Her gentle virtues did not fail to win upon his better nature, but the marriage had been based upon political considerations solely, and he soon began to tire of the restraints it imposed. Memory often dwelt upon the fascinating charms of the fair Egyptian, and he longed to return to her again, but durst not hazard a rupture with his brother-in-law and co-triumvir. Years passed by. The world had been divided between the triumvirs, and Antony had received for his portion the countries lying east of the Ionian Sea. Important matters of state, and the active duties of his life diverted his mind from Cleopatra, yet she was not forgotten. The condition of affairs in Syria once more demanded his attention, and leaving Octavia behind him at Rome, he revisited the scenes around which clustered so many pleasant but guilty recollections. There Cleopatra joined him again, upon his earnest solicitation, though she did not attempt to conceal her anger because he had deserted her and married Octavia. She was still ambitious, and still claimed the name and station of his wife. She loved him also, it may be, and was jealous of her Roman rival. To appease her, therefore, he gave her the provinces of Phoenicia, the Lower Syria, the Isle of Cyprus, and a great part of Cilicia, with the balm-producing portion of Judea and a large and fertile tract of Arabia. Upon the twin children, Alexander and Cleopatra, which she had borne him, he bestowed the surnames of the Sun and Moon. After spending several months with him, Cleopatra returned to Egypt, and he proceeded against the Parthians with a powerful and well-appointed army. But the unwise delay was fatal to the expedition, which was wholly unsuccessful, and when he returned to Phoenicia, it was with the mere remnant of the proud array he had led across the sandy plains of Syria. The timely arrival of Cleopatra at Sidon, where he awaited her, with supplies of clothing and provisions, alone saved his army from utter destruction. Henceforth, the wiles of the charming queen were far more powerful with Antony than all other influences combined. Now that he was restored to her, she resolved not to lose sight of him again. Separated from him, she was but the sovereign of a petty kingdom. With him, a ruler of the world, she was not only the companion of his pleasures, but she governed and controlled him. Accordingly, all her arts were employed to retain him near her, and they were not employed in vain. Octavia came as far as Athens to meet her lord and husband, but he sent her back to Rome with bitter words. This was Cleopatra's triumph, but she rued it bitterly in the hour of her humiliation. She saved Egypt from the Romans' grasp, but sacrificed herself. Antony became her veriest slave. For her sake he heaped indignities upon his lawful wife, and added to them the last and foulest one of all, repudiation. She conquered but unmanned him. The pride and daring of the soldier were not, indeed, altogether subdued in the effeminacy of the lover and the weakness of the debauchee. After spending another winter at the Egyptian capital, wearied and sated with pleasures, he took the field again the following spring. Armenia was conquered, and its captive monarch dragged through Alexandria, where he celebrated his triumph, at his chariot wheels, laden with chains of gold, and thus presented to the lovely siren who was the victor's victor. Again the banquet and the feast filled up the time, and sport and revelry and dalliance made Antony the wreck of what he was. But his return to Rome was thus prevented, and it was that she ardently desired. Her charms were fading now. In a few years their influence would be no longer felt, and it would seem that she hoped to retain her power by ministering to his coarser passions and desires. Once more he prepared to lead his soldiers against the Parthian. Cleopatra had promised to accompany him to the Euphrates, and she had pictured to herself bright scenes of future glory and conquest. But before they set out upon the expedition, the ceremony of the coronation of herself and children was performed. In the palace court, a throne of solid gold, with steps of silver, was ordered to be placed. Seated upon this, and clad in a robe of gorgeous purple embroidered with gold and fastened with diamonds, was Antony himself, with a golden scepter in his hand, at his side a Persian scimitar, and on his head the diadem of the Persian kings. On his right hand was Cleopatra, in the robes of Isis made of costly asbeston, the lotus twined about the diadem upon her head, and in her hand the rattling sistrum. Beneath them sat Caesarion, the son of Julius Caesar, and Alexander and Ptolemy, the sons of Antony and Cleopatra. At Antony's command, the heralds proclaimed Cleopatra Queen of Egypt, Cyprus, Libya, and Lower Syria, and named her son Caesarion as her colleague. The other princes were then proclaimed kings of kings, and the kingdoms and provinces of the East were divided between them. Thus ended the pageant, and it was all but empty show. Cleopatra accompanied Antony in his expedition, for they were now inseparable. They proceeded as far as the Araxes, but alarming news from Rome recalled them. They then directed their course to Greece. At Ephesus, at Samos, and at Athens, spending weeks and months in revelry and feasting, which, profitably employed, would have made them masters of Rome, and thus realized the glorious dreams of her proud ambition. Never was woman so self-deceived. She anticipated an easy victory over the stripling Caesar when Antony declared war against him. Her jealous pride rose high with the thought that Octavia would be humbled, that Antony would be the world's great master, and she its mistress. The delusion was not a strange one, and from it she never woke, till, from her galley's deck at Actium, she saw that all was lost. Had Antony pushed on to Rome, he could scarcely have failed of victory. It was not his wish that Cleopatra should remain with him, but, fearing, with very good reason, that a reconciliation would take place between Octavius and Antony if she returned to Egypt, she bribed one of the counselors of the latter, in whom he placed great confidence, to advise that she should continue at his side. Antony lingered away most precious time, and when at last he ventured to risk an engagement, he listened to the advice of Cleopatra, instead of following his own better judgment, and offered battle at sea. The hostile fleets encountered each other before the promontory of Actium. Foreseeing certain defeat, on account of the imbecility and want of skill displayed by Antony, Cleopatra determined to secure her own personal safety, and left the scene of the engagement with her 50 galleys. Antony might still have made a noble stand, but his courageous spirit seemed to have forsaken him. He gave up everything, without a struggle worthy of his name and character, and followed the flying Cleopatra. Having been received into her galley, they hastened with all speed to Alexandria, not to make a noble stand in defense of what was left to them, but to forget their folly in the wildest excesses, or in the intervals of dissipation, to load each other with reproaches. It is as two jealous lovers, not bound together by the sacred tendrils of an honest affection, but united by an unholy passion, that Antony and Cleopatra are from this time to be regarded. They loved and hated one another by turns. They doubted and deceived each other. One day she spent in feasting with him as in former days, and on the next refused to see him. She feared, as had been the case before so often, that Antony would make his peace with Caesar, and so she resolved to provide for her own security by secretly dispatching friendly messages to the conqueror. Upon the arrival of Octavius with his army before the walls of Alexandria, the warrior heart of Antony aroused itself once more. He made a gallant sally, and drove back the advancing legions. But the advantage he received was but temporary, and on the following day the fleet of Cleopatra was surrendered by her command to Caesar. Antony sought the queen forthwith to charge her with her treachery, but she had now immured herself, with all her most valuable treasures, in a lofty tomb which she had caused to be erected beside the temple of Isis. In reply to the inquiries of Antony, from whose ungovernable rage the worst consequences were feared in case they saw each other then, it was told him that she had killed herself. His love for her at once returned, and shutting himself up in his apartment, he fell upon his sword. At this moment an officer came to inform him that Cleopatra was still alive, and at his request he was carried to the tomb, and there he died, folded in her arms, those arms whose fascinating embraces had brought him to this strait. By stratagem, the officers of Octavius obtained admission into the tomb, whereupon she attempted to stab herself with a dagger, but her design was frustrated by their interference. Octavius himself now came to see her. She appeared before him clothed in a simple under tunic, thinking, perhaps, the charms displayed so freely might move him, but he did not deign to notice them. The deadly sorrow charactered in her face had robbed her of her former beauty. She then urged him with tears to spare her children and herself, and leave them undisturbed in Egypt. He promised fairly, but she doubted him, and she determined to die by her own hand rather than be led in triumph, like the humblest slave, before the car of the Roman conqueror. This degradation she had always feared. Her high soul revolted at the prospect which she saw before her, and sooner than be young Caesar's captive, she resolved to perish nobly. Although unqueened, yet like a queen. With the effect of different poisons she had made herself perfectly familiar, and either by this means, or, as was commonly believed, by the bite of an asp secretly introduced into the tomb, her life was ended. Such was the fate of Cleopatra. Faults and vices she exhibited which, revolting as they were, need not be excused in her, for they were characteristic of her age. Though her virtues were mental only, they deserve to be remembered. It should not be forgotten also that history, all partial to the Roman as it is, has scarcely done her justice. She loved Caesar, and to her it seemed not guilty. She was ambitious too, not only desiring to save her throne and kingdom, but to reign in Rome. In her intercourse with Antony, she was prompted not by sensual motives only, but chiefly by policy and ambition. She was indeed mistaken as to the effect of the means and arts which she employed to win him to her. Judged by the times in which she lived, this was her error. End of Section 4.